If you're new with us and you're following the outline, the verses in bold are the ones that we're going to kind of go into depth in. Hopefully, if we have time. We don't always have time. We're definitely going to prioritize our group discussions. But I do want to jump in. In fact, before we get into verse 1, if you want to flip to the very end of your outline, I just want to touch on something funny. So it came to my attention this week that there is... more or less, there's a group of proverbs that are characterized, even from ancient times, as ironies and jokes. They were literally told as jokes. And how many of you know that, let's see, what's a good example? I was talking with JT about this, actually, a handful of months ago. Oftentimes when dictators come to power, like in the ancient world, does anybody know who the first people they eliminate out of like the royal courts were? They were the jesters. And the jester's job was to take like the wise counsel's information, filter it into a funny way, and deliver it to the king or to the dictator in a way that would make them laugh and say, oh yeah, okay, I get it. That's what's true. So humor is a delivery mechanism for true things in a different way that people will receive. And so there's a group of proverbs that are actually jokes. And 22:13, the sluggard says, there is a lion outside. I shall be killed in the streets. Last week we read this proverb from Proverbs 20. This is 20 verse 4. The sluggard does not plow in the autumn, but then he shows up to the harvest and finds out he has nothing. Almost like the joke is, doesn't do any work up front, then shows up to the harvest, and it never dawned on the lazy person that, wait a second, I have to work for stuff? This is crazy. I thought the harvest is just supposed to grow from the ground. So that, paired with 22:13, there's a lion outside, I shall be killed in the streets. They're both jokes. They're humorous on purpose, and here's the joke, is that Solomon is writing Proverbs, this chunk of Proverbs, and it's likely the context is like right there in Jerusalem. And guess what doesn't exist in downtown Jerusalem? Lions. There's not lions prowling the street in downtown Jerusalem. So what is the joke? That someone who's super lazy and doesn't want to work for a living can do what? They can imagine the most outlandish excuses ever. Have you ever met someone who has an excuse that you're like, anybody with two brain cells touching realizes you're making an excuse, but that person thinks they're fooling you? Have you ever met that kind of person? Yeah. And so the joke is, oh, I can't possibly work today. I can't possibly leave the house or turn the TV off. There's a lion outside. I could die. I could be killed in the streets. I could die out there if I had to go to work. So the joke is that the lazy person will come up with any excuse whatsoever to not go to work. So I think here is the spiritual tidbit, is beware of excuse makers. Because we know from Proverbs that associating or having close friendships with people who are not willing to work for things or not willing to connect the dots of their labor, their input affects the output. That's a spiritual principle. Beware of those people. Proverbs Solomon is telling those who would listen that be careful of people who make really ridiculous excuses. That's not going to end well for your friendship. So that's where I thought we would start, just with a little bit of a laugh. Now let's turn back to Proverbs chapter 1. Thanks for that, Wanda. It was like a courtesy laugh. It was like 2 minutes late, but I appreciate it. All right. Before we get going, you may have noticed that as you read Proverbs 22 that I had nothing in bold in that second section, which starts at verse 17. Most scholars, they break Proverbs into 3 different sections. The first, you'll probably remember, is chapters 1 through 9. We covered a few of those. Those are like those open letters to the son. So I write to you, my son. The second chunk goes from chapter 10 all the way to where we just got that 22:16 marker. So this huge chunk are all these kind of what appear on the page to be a little bit scattered wisdom sayings, all compiled with a purpose. These are always attributed to Solomon. And then 22:17 through 31 is sort of seen as the third section. So that's kind of a breaking point in Proverbs when people study it. So like even in a commentary, for instance, you have to turn to an entirely new chapter to get into verse 17. So if you're curious about that, that's why. So let's look at verse 1. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. There's actually a proverb we read tonight that talks about wealth is often a byproduct of wise living. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed that? I was reading an article a while back in the Wall Street Journal, and it was saying, it was talking about the hidden millionaires of America. Do you know what the common millionaire in America does for a living? They work 9 to 5 in an office for approximately 40 years. That's who they are. So how do they become millionaires? They actually are those who are making wise financial decisions over long periods of time. And in our culture, we're very obsessed with like that person hit the lottery and that person invented something to treat cancer or something like that. But in reality, there's wise principles that over time, they add up into these things. So Proverbs 22, verse 1 says, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches. So while great riches might be the byproduct of wise living, it is not the thing to set your sights on, your compass to, and say, that's where I'm going. I'm going to live my life in such a way to get rich. And favor is better than silver or gold. A good name is just a reputation that's honorable and well known for integrity and value. The idea of high esteem. John Wesley put it this way: high esteem is a good report among men. So you go around and you say, hey, do you know Greg? Ricardo, do you know Greg? Yeah, I know him. He's an awesome guy. He loves the Lord. That is the high esteem, that people recognize that person and they speak highly of them even behind their back. Now, if a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and we're to pursue high esteem, that people would say, that person has integrity and value behind our backs. Do you see a cultural issue with this proverb as wisdom? What is the problem in our culture? Show me the money, baby.
Reputation doesn't pay the bills.
Yeah, reputation. Oh, I like that. Reputation's not going to pay the bills. I told my table I read lately that the most common answer to what do you want to be when you grow up to middle schoolers in America is social media influencer. Did you say that? Yeah. Yeah. YouTuber. Why is that? Why is that? It's popular. Okay, so it might not be silver and gold, but what is this? What is the compass set to? Money, popularity, status. All of these things, I think, kind of go together. And I think the point is not what they are, it's what they're not. They are not reputation and esteem. So let's talk a little bit about reputation and esteem. Reputation, it turns out, takes a lot of time to build. You know, you could buy a lotto ticket. I don't advise buying a lotto ticket, ever. But you could buy a lotto ticket and 1 in a trillion, whatever the odds are, you could get rich like really quickly. By doing literally nothing but walking into a Chevron station, handing over a couple dollars, you could get rich that way. Do we all agree? You cannot go somewhere to a vending machine, put in a few dollars, and have it pop out your reputation, can you? So how do you build a good reputation? What do you need? What are the ingredients?
You show up on time.
Okay.
You don't leave early.
Okay, so you show up, you put in your time. I think this is a key word. What's that? Okay, so you're true to your word. Anything else? Trustworthy. We're going to keep going. I'm not going to bend down that bad because my back is hurting a little bit. So, anything else you want to add? Maybe during the break, Greg can adjust me on the stage again. Or not Greg, I'm sorry, Mark. Greg, I definitely don't want you to adjust me on the stage. You had to be here. Mark literally was like, lay down. I got you, and he crunched me right there. Okay, so reputation takes a long time to build. I think even our culture, even though, let's just put it this way. I think our culture and our society recognizes that reputations take a long time to build. We actually have laws to protect reputations. What are those laws called? Slander, defamation. Now, these things are there to protect that someone could say something to basically like character assassinate you, right? Now, those things they're good. Would you say they're a good thing, that there's something in place to protect somebody's good name? But there's a problem, because our culture is moving so quickly. If you end up in a headline for doing something, even if you never did it and it's a complete fabricated lie, how many people are going to stick with the story long enough to find out, oh, it was actually a lie? So we have these movements throughout our country. Just in the last 10 years, you get accused of insert key word that's a hot button topic, your life is pretty much over, and it doesn't really matter if it comes back around, right? You could have been fired, and your employer is probably not going to be like, oh, you were innocent, why don't you come on back? It's probably like, your name is in headlines on the internet, let's not deal with that. By the way, there are huge corporations that employ like $1 million a year services to scrub the internet of anything negative that's ever been said about you. You're nodding your head, you know probably more about it than I do. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We'll dismiss around the table. Here is kind of the prompt and the question. The wisdom of Proverbs is clear. This is in your outline, so you don't have to write it down. Reputation and favor are to be pursued over riches. However, our cultural value is the opposite, that we should pursue wealth and status to such a great length that even sacrificing our reputation would often be accepted or acceptable. Discuss the cultural value and how, as Christians, we're tempted to believe this lie. So the lie is, I could still be a Christian and pursue anything other than God's wisdom for my life. What disciplines and practices can we adopt to invest in our good name without any pursuit of wealth or status? Now, I want to be really clear before we dismiss. Wealth and status are not bad. Proverbs, in fact, says wealth and status are often a byproduct of wise living, but wise living is never in the direction of wealth and status. Wisdom begins with what? The fear of the Lord. So where does wisdom start? It starts with knowing God, spending time with God, being disciplined every day to pursue God, and those things are often a byproduct. But when you set your sights and your compass on those things, Proverbs is very clear. That's the opposite of wisdom. It's foolishness. So you have the question, why don't we take 12 minutes or so? That's very precise. I meant 10 minutes and 41 seconds. I don't know why I said that. 10 minutes-ish is where we're going. And then we'll regroup and we'll hear what some of you had to say. So ready, set, go. Curious to hear some of your thoughts, so maybe wrap up your conversations. Okay, what are our thoughts on trading reputation for wealth or status or any of those things, and what we can tangibly do to kind of fight back against that? You're sitting right here now. I'm just going to stare at you. I know it makes you uncomfortable. Your wife thinks it's so funny when I stare at you. Look at her. Anybody want to share anything? Yeah, Greg.
Prisha said to be more like Jesus. And then we were talking about that. What did Jesus do? Was he always in a hurry? Was he pursuing riches? He was never in a hurry. He always, like John said to Pastor Danny, be a slow walker.
Yeah.
And how it's good to be approachable and to see, instead of being so focused on where you're going, what you need to do, you miss so many people that are hurting. And so as you study what Jesus did, and I guess that would be a discipline, right? Study Jesus.
Yeah.
To be like him by reading and asking him what he did, how he did it, and observing what he did. And it's remarkable.
Yeah.
He was God of the universe, yet he wasn't pursuing wealth.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think just the life of Jesus itself has so many disciplines. I was thinking as you were talking about this passage in Mark where the disciples wake up, they're scrambling, like, we got to go to the next place, but where did he go? And they don't find him with the Wall Street Journal checking the stock market portfolio to see how he's doing. They find him in a quiet place, just intimately connecting with the Father, right? Yeah. Anybody else have any observations about kind of the intersection of wealth and reputation and what it does to us? Cecil's pointing at everyone at this table.
Let's not see.
Yeah, Cecil, what do you think? Well, we don't need to belabor it if you felt like you had a good conversation. I think one comment that was made that, sometimes somebody makes such a simple, like precise comment. They're like, why didn't I think about that? I've been speaking in paragraphs trying to land and like one word does it. But I think Danny had just said, where do you find your contentment? And I was thinking, you know what? Some people I think really do seem to think that if I just, got another zero on my bank account or a sweeter car or something, like I would be content. And I think if you come to that reality that maybe there's parts of your life that really does feel that way, I think the right thing to do is not to immediately turn and condemn yourself like, oh, I'm such an idiot, I'm pursuing the wrong thing. It's, God, my heart really desires that. I really do desire that. There's something deep in me that wants that. I know that's not of you, but it's really where my heart is at. So would you kind of intervene? Would you meet me maybe early in the morning in prayer? Would you meet me in your word? Would you help me to have kind of the discipline to come to you often and recognize it faster and faster? I think being honest up front about it. The reality is our culture has been shaping this in all of us since the day we were born. Every billboard, every commercial. I think I've told you this before, but we occasionally will let Colton watch these YouTube kids shows. And the one weird thing about YouTube Kids compared to like Netflix or Amazon or whatever the streaming service is, because we don't have cable, he does not know what commercials are. But Amazon has real ads that come on because it's not a paid service, you know what I mean? And I was sitting there doing the dishes the other day while he was watching a show, and I was having these flashbacks of watching the Nickelodeon commercials. Every commercial is your friends will think you're so cool if you have this toy. You just need to go ask your parents right now. Toys R Us, except now you can just do it online. So everything, even as a 4 or 5-year-old, is like, buy this toy, get this stuff. And at the end of the day, the contentment is like a junk box full of miscellaneous Legos that were bought on eBay for like 10 pounds for $40, poured on the floor and creativity gets flowing. But a kid can get sucked into it so fast, and we can get sucked into it too. So I think the honesty is a great place to start. I was asking myself this question, like, where do you know when you've crossed the line? And I think this is the beauty of how Proverbs gets organized, because I have this hunch that Solomon had this question in mind as well, because I think throughout Proverb 22, he tries to answer the question, like, how do we know when we're now pursuing wealth over reputation? And I think the thing that he does is he compares two groups of people that turns out were often clashed against each other in the ancient world, and they still are. The poor versus the rich. And I think this is probably primarily about wealth and how much money, but this could be in a lot of ways. This could be status. This could be job title. This could be education level. This could be all of those things. And so that's our next section, the rich and the poor. So verse 2 says this: the rich and the poor meet together. Let's pause right there. Anybody notice anything interesting about this phrase? Anything you know about Solomon? Who is Solomon? He is the king. And by title alone, does Solomon meet with the poor? I think he does. I think he does periodically throughout his life. We know that he has his ups and his downs. But his job title alone, is he supposed to meet with the poor? No, we've actually talked about this. Like in Rome, there was certain Caesars who literally wanted like palm branches or coats laid in the street when they entered. Why? I don't want to touch the same dirt as those commoners, right? Anybody ever heard of the Roman Emperor Nero? Sitting on his back porch one night and he gets a whiff. The winds have changed and he smells. What does he smell? The slums. I can't believe they smell that bad. So what is the legend? We don't know if it's true or not, but what is the legend that he does? He orders it burned down, and then he skips town, and it actually becomes the largest fire in Roman history. So there is this dichotomy of the filthy rich in the ancient world don't have to interact at all if they don't want to with the poor. Does that sound familiar? Does it sound familiar that sometimes you watch like celebrities do like their videos, and you realize they are so out of touch with just normal people, they have no idea what they're talking about? So that still exists. And then he writes these words: the rich and the poor meet together. There's some indication that this is actually a command to mix company on purpose. Why would that be? Because the Lord is the maker of them all. So what is the first kind of spiritual tenet of the rich versus the poor? The first thing Solomon wants you to remember is what? They are made in the image of God. I think Job actually says this. It's his final answer, or one of his final answers. He says, I've basically searched everything in my life to find out if I really did have something wrong with me, and it dawned on me, even when my slaves came to me with a concern, I treated them with the same dignity I would give myself. And then he says this, because they were knitted in their mother's womb just like I was. So this is this recognition. So their origin is the Lord. The Lord made them both, and because of that, they have inherent value. We can move on. Verse 7 says this: the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender. Does anybody know who quotes this verse all the time? Dave Ramsey. Yeah, this is like a Dave Ramsey special right here. The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. This is kind of classic. We got to make this distinction. This is a description. This is not a prescription. So what does that mean? What does it mean that this is a description? Okay, it's not a formula to get rich. If you look around the world and you see like who rules over who, what is generally true? People with power also have money, and it seems like pretty much through all time that's usually how socially people are organized. But he says this: the rich rule over the poor. Why is this so? Because the borrower is the slave to the lender. I did some digging this week, and this is what I learned. In the ancient world, a loan was always needed collateral, which I think is still the case. But here's some of the collateral that was often preferred. Land and livestock. Basically, for somebody who is already poor to use land or livestock as their collateral, if they were to lose it, they would go basically from poor to beyond impoverished. And do you know what they had to do in the ancient world? They had to sell themselves into slavery to buy themselves back out. Really nasty practice, but often what they did if they had big families was they sold a child into slavery and said, here's my 12-year-old son, you can have 4 years of his labor to pay off my family's debt. So this happens a lot. Oftentimes, the rich would put stringent conditions on loans, basically hoping that they would be defaulted on and they could get more stuff. Some of the things that they often did is they used this as power to tell the borrower which crops they had to plant on their field, when they had to harvest it, and so on. And so, as you can imagine, this would create very harsh feelings between classes of people. So I think here's the heart of the proverb. It's to inform the lender, so the wealthy person, of a condition they might not be fully aware of. Why? Because if you don't hang out with other people, you might not be aware of, hey, your desire for more is actually dehumanizing and not seeing the image of God in someone. And then I think the second part is to warn the borrower of just how serious maybe just chipping off a little loan here and there could potentially be. Verse 9, whoever has a bountiful eye will be blessed. This is kind of a cool phrase. I didn't know this, but we actually get this phrase from Hebrew. I had no idea until this week. Evil eye. What does it mean to give someone the evil eye? It's to look at them in a way that says, I wish, curse on you. Evil eye. The opposite of evil eye is, turns out, bountiful eye. I had no idea. So let's read it again. Whoever has a bountiful eye. What does it mean to look at somebody with a bountiful eye? I wish blessing on you. I could just live with my look like, hey, I want the very best for you. That's what my eyes are communicating to you. It says, and throughout the scripture, the eyes are one of the outlets to reveal what? The state of your heart, yeah. For he shares his bread with the poor. So someone with a bountiful eye that wishes the best, the blessings for others, is also someone who the intention of their heart is good. And so what do? They share what they have to be a blessing to the poor. I think it's interesting that it says he shares his bread with the poor, not he shares his gold with the poor. Some commentaries here are saying it's describing someone who also is not super well off, but is willing to share what little they have. Does that sound like maybe a woman who's tithing in the New Testament? And what does Jesus say about her? She's given more than everyone else combined. Why? Because she gave from a heart condition that said, I will be generous even to the last penny. So sharing possessions is a virtue. And to share with the poor is to cross boundaries that maybe cultures and societies say you don't cross. But God says there's actually a very special blessing when that happens. I think one of the very cool things that I love about our church is, maybe it might seem like a little nasty to talk about it this way, but there are socioeconomics of every kind at this church. Did you know that? And we live in one of the wealthiest places on the planet, which could be a temptation to say like, oh, this is just like rich guy and gal church or something like that. But that's not the case at all. God says there's actually a blessing when you share community with people who are at all different places in kind of the socioeconomic ladder. Okay, the last verse, and then we're going to jump into another discussion question. Whoever oppresses the poor to increase his own wealth or gives to the rich will only come to poverty. I love that a 3,000 plus year old book has already boiled down descriptions in a way that you think, I'm pretty sure that's how this still works. So what does Solomon say are the two main ways of getting and keeping wealth? He just said it. Number one, oppress the poor. So what does that mean? Yeah. It means take advantage of them. If you own a company, downsize the amount of workers and increase the amount of work for the max profits. The bottom line is number one. Even if this becomes just kind of a meat grinder that spits people out and we just got to keep hiring people and it's not paying bills and all this stuff, right? So you oppress the poor, you take advantage of the poor. That's one way to get rich. Once you get rich or you want to stay rich, what's the second part of the strategy? You give gifts to the rich. What does that look like?
Keeping them on your side.
Yeah, keep them on the side. Tangibly, what kind of things would be done?
Give them the best spot.
Yeah.
Best good.
Oh, that's good because that's a Bible metaphor, right? Give them the best spot at the banquet. What does Jesus say? Take the worst spot. And then the leader of the banquet will say, what are you doing over there? Come over here to the seat of honor, right? Interesting. Okay, so you might be tempted to give the seat of honor to the rich guy, right? Maybe you favor in friendship someone who might be able to do you a favor, right? I'm trying to go on a sweet vacation. I think I know a guy who owns a sweet house in the place I would like to go. Like, hey, what are you doing this summer, right? This kind of stuff. Okay, oppress the poor, give to the rich. In the ancient world, overcharging the poor, do we remember all the proverbs about like quit messing with the scales? Everybody in Proverbs seems to be messing with scales in the marketplace, and we learn that a lot of those scales are the word for like the small scale, like someone who's just trying to get enough flour to bake one loaf of bread, and Proverbs is saying you're messing with even that scale, and God's wrath is coming upon you. So you oppress the rich, giving special people special favors to the rich. You keep wealthy people in your good graces. You buy favors. You buy access. Anybody follow the celebrity scandal where they basically bought their kids into USC? Did you guys follow that? And it was basically this in a nutshell. Like, who do we know? Here's who we know. Who are the power brokers? Hey, we want to get our kid in. What can we do? And then it just basically became like a money scheme of how can we get money from point A to point B without people asking questions. And I think a lot of people went to jail for it. Okay, so here's the outcome. It says, don't oppress the poor to increase your wealth or give to the rich. Both will come to poverty. Now you might say, well, that's not true because there's plenty of people who oppress the poor and give to the rich and they are not impoverished. Is that true? It turns out this word poverty is a much more general word. It doesn't necessarily mean just wealth. It can mean physical bad health. How many of you know the stress or anxiety or shame that people carry around can actually impact their physical health? That's true. So you live a life of oppressing the poor. Is there some inkling of shame that you carry with you? Yeah, it could manifest itself in bad physical health. Emotional poverty, bad friendships, no deep connections, nobody who actually calls and really wants to know. One of these things that you hear a lot about celebrities is they'll say this, like, in order to stay in the music business, I had to cut out all the yes men in my life. Anyone who flatters me, I just fire them immediately. Why? Because when you're the honeypot and you got all the cash, people will surround you and tell you whatever you want to know, right? And if you don't do anything, you could wake up one day and realize, I have 500 people around me at all times and I have this many friends. It could be spiritual poverty. It could just be, even if you recognize it or not, that there is a spiritual separation between me and God. Why? Because at its core, the same theme is true. This is the failure to recognize the image of God in every single person. The Fortune 500 CEO and the guy begging for change on the corner, they both bear the image of God. So here's the prompt. All the way at the beginning of Genesis and throughout the entire Bible, it's clear. Humans are made in God's image, and we are to treat all people accordingly. However, humans are prone to tribalism and the us versus them thinking based on wealth, nationality, age, race, all of that stuff. Discuss what happens when we forget or refuse to see God's image in other people. So I would encourage you, if you're comfortable, talk about yourself. What happens to you? Maybe you're cranky. Maybe you didn't sleep well. Maybe a kid was sick for 3 nights in a row and you didn't sleep at all, right? And you forget for a moment that that person at the drive-through window is made in the image of God. Like, what happens to us? Because I think when we humanize it in us, it invites people to be real and honest with each other. Where would you like to grow in recognizing the image of God in every person you encounter? Maybe it's as simple as, I have a coworker, I can't stand them, and as I'm sitting here, I'm convicted that, oh man, you made him in your image. That's going to change how I have to operate with him tomorrow, and I'm being convicted of that. That could be it. So discuss how you would like to grow in that way, and then we'll kind of regather from there. So why don't we take 6-7 minutes, and then we'll wrap up for the night. I hate to cut us off, but just for the sake of time, we're going to wrap up. I hope that was fruitful for you. I don't want to try to jam if we don't have to, but I think this particular chunk of 2 verses is important enough that we should cover it. So if you need to step out, please do. Don't feel any pressure to, but I am going to try to push forward for 4 or 5 more minutes just so we can kind of wrap up. But this is a very famous passage. If you've been around here for any amount of time, you've heard Millie Britt say it, I'm sure, because I've heard Millie Britt say it. It says this in verse 6. Train up a child in the way he or she should go. Even when they are old, they will not depart from it. It's a very famous verse. How many of you have heard it? How many of you feel like, hey, my parents lived by that with me? Yeah, what a blessing that would be, yeah. I want to just point out a couple things, and I want to bring this together with verse 15. But the first is this, is that this is not a promise. We got to know this. This does not mean that, man, I did everything I could. I prayed over my child. I spoke the scriptures into them, and they're like utterly failing out there in the world. And I think this is why it's important that it's not a promise. It's a principle. If it were a promise, then you would be left at night thinking like, man, I'm such an epic failure. I'm such a terrible parent. What did I do wrong? And you'd be racked with guilt. The reality is Proverbs are this invitation to live by wisdom. And we've talked about this a lot, that living by all this wisdom combined, and we talked about Job and Ecclesiastes and these sorts of things all together are kind of a blueprint for how to live a life that's successful in the sense that you live into the people the way we were programmed to live by our Creator. So we train up a child in the way they should go. Sometimes children veer off the path. Sometimes they do, and then they come back. Thank God for that. It is, however, it's an exhortation and a command for every parent. that this is not an option. This is not like, hey, this is a good idea. This is a command that if you have children and you want to raise them in the Lord, you need to train them up in the way they should go. What does this mean? It means that a wise parent bears the responsibility for their child. It says, I will take responsibility for who you are becoming as a child. In our culture, we say 18 is like you're an adult. That is debatable. I think the pendulum has swung. Sometimes people are like, 25 might be more realistic. Ancient Jews thought what age was more appropriate? 12, 13, right? They thought this was more appropriate. So I think that we have to take some of this into consideration. But a wise person will take responsibility for their child. And the first thing they'll say is not like, why are you screwing up so bad? It's, what could I change to help you live out who God created you to be? Which is the last point. I think this is very important. To train up a child in the way they should go is the emphasis on the way they should go. The only way you know the way your child should go is to bear with them in prayer and say, God, who did you create this child to be? How many of you have seen somebody force their child a round peg, or what am I trying to say here? Square peg, round hole. There we go. That's what I meant to say. You are going to be a doctor or a lawyer. That is final. And you're like, that is an artist kid. I can just see it from a mile away. That's a musical artist kid. This is not going to end well. How many of you know and have seen that happen? It requires, I know this child. I know their passions. I know their weaknesses. I know what makes them tick. God, would you give me vision for how I can prepare them in every way possible that they would live into the person you created them to be? And sometimes I think culturally this can be difficult if you're a parent to swallow, because sometimes if we're honest, that whole status and riches thing is a very real temptation on this end too. It's, where is your child going? Oh, my child got a full ride scholarship to Yale. And you're like, oh, my child's going to welding school. And you feel like somehow you have to brush that under the rug as though somehow that is better than this. The reality is, man, if your child was called by God to higher education, they excelled, and you did everything you could, and they got that, praise God for that, right? And praise God if you're like, this kid loves working with their hands. They love being outside. They love people. They love being rugged and working on stuff. You could say man, isn't it awesome your kid pursued that, and they did it because you helped them, and my kid did too. Yeah, high five, right? It's not a competition. So pursuing the way that they should go requires that you ask God, which way should this child go? Even when they are old, they will not depart from it. Verse 15 says this, folly is bound up in the heart of a child. What does that mean? Children do dumb stuff. You ever notice this? Jimmy, I'm sorry, Jimmy, but you told me this story. I can cut it out of YouTube if you don't. That Koa just jumped off of a platform, full speed, ran and jumped off a platform straight into a brick wall. I think this is he's young. He's not making cognitive, dumb middle school decisions. But this is kind of in a nutshell, you just scratch your head sometimes, why did you do that? Why? Because folly, wisdom tells us, is in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. Now, this is an interesting phrase. We've talked about it before. The rod of discipline. What's the first thing you think of? Spanking. I am not here to tell you whether you should spank or not. If my experience tells me correctly, there's people on both sides of these sorts of things, and I definitely want to try to toe the middle line on this one. But the rod of discipline doesn't necessarily mean that you just spank your kid at every point. What it means, I think, in an ancient Hebrew household in that context, is that the child knows that you have the rod and that you are able to use it. Maybe they know from experience. And Millie, what is your comment that you always say to me? That you need to make them mind. Is that what you say? Make them mind. You might think that you're telling me stuff that I forget, but I remember. The idea is that you got out of line, I'm spanking you again. It's you got out of line and you recognize that as your father, I am an authority figure in your life. And my job is to help you live into discipline by disciplining you. We're going through this thing right now that when you wake up, you make your bed. And we're 4 out of 7 days a week now where it's I got out of bed and I made my bed. Great. And we're also like 3 out of 7, like wake up in full-blown meltdown. I hate making my bed. This stinks. Why do you make me do this? I'm like, dude, you could have already been done by now instead of expending the energy to cry about it, right? So the rod of discipline drives out folly from a child. Why? Because a child needs to grow into adulthood. It won't just naturally happen. They are entrusted to parents to help them grow into adulthood. And mature adulthood is pursuing what God created them to do and who God created them to be. So here's how we'll wrap up. You can flip to the last page. I'd like you just to go around your table and pray together. There's a prompt there, and you're welcome to follow it. I would encourage you to pray if you feel like, oh, I'm not sure if I should pray out loud. You should. You are in one of the most gracious places you're ever going to find on planet Earth. This is the place for that. But I do want you to make room for prayer requests. If there's someone who has something really heavy, don't hesitate to just say, like, hey, let's just call an audible and let's just all pray for this 1 or 2 people. Whatever that might be, just use discernment and discretion. You guys are wonderful people, and I'm sure you'll walk in that. So why don't we do that for the next couple minutes, and then I'll just wrap us up in prayer when we're done, and we can go from there. God, thank you for your goodness, and thank you for your faithfulness to reveal wisdom to us through your word. Thank you that for thousands of years, those who have turned to the book of Proverbs have left it with deep thoughts that push us into more faithful action, that we would follow you. And so, God, we want chances this week. Would you put us in situations where we get to make choices, where we get to maybe see the image of God in people that we've been refusing to see it in? Would you help us to pause? Would you hold our thoughts captive in ways that maybe are increasing day by day? I pray for the discipline. I pray over those who are parents of children in the room. I pray that we would take seriously the commitment to raise them up in the way they should go. But I also pray that we would live into the joy that is, that it's not just a heavy burden or responsibility, although in some ways it is. It's also the great, great joy. And so I pray that you would remind us of that. Would you bring joy in unexpected ways into our lives this week, that we would recognize you in every single place we look. We love you. Thank you for this time, and we head into our Wednesday night and Thursday morning knowing that you're with us. Would we remind each other of it often? Amen.